This is Heart Rhythm TV, and I'm Daniel Alyesh here with Late Breaking Science at the FHRS 2026 Scientific Session here in Chicago. And today we're going to be discussing the 6-month data of the FlexPulse IDE study. And I'm joined today by Dr. John Piccini, the presenting author. Welcome.
Thanks, Dan. It's great to be here.
Yeah. So we had 188 patients with symptomatic drug-refractory paroxysmal AFib in the FlexPulse IDE 6-month study. Tell us overall what we learned.
Yeah, so in this dual-energy single-tip catheter ablation system, the effectiveness at 6 months was 87%, and the major or primary safety endpoint was a 7-day safety endpoint, and there were only 3 patients who had a safety event for a primary safety event rate of 1.7. When we peel back the layers of the onion and look at the actual data, a couple of things to point out. This is the 6-month result. So, of course, the 12-month effectiveness endpoint is the primary effectiveness endpoint that we'll hear about down the road. Within those patients, about 37% had PVI plus an additional adjunctive lesion set. Among those who underwent PVI only, which is what we would expect the majority obviously would be because it's a paroxysmal population, 93% of the PVI was done with PFA only.
Well, very interesting data. I think that a couple of things jump out at me. Number one, we have a paroxysmal study, but we have a lot of people going outside the pulmonary veins. I think something with the flexibility of the Duo catheter allows us to do that. And I'll also say that, as a participant in this study, we did an EP study, we induced AVNRT, and we were able to ablate a slow pathway. And I think there was a series of us that did that, and we published that paper as well, too. So I think the flexibility that this offers is very interesting.
To comment on that, I think a lot of people ask, well, what is the rationale for a study like this? And PFA has transformed our field, but most of the approved PFA catheters we have are large footprint, and I completely agree. The flexibility, the ability to provide precise lesions and customizable lesion sets, I think is really important. And then, getting beyond the pulmonary veins, it's also important to point out that a full quarter of the population had concomitant atrial flutter at baseline. So I think when viewed in that context, the ablation outside the veins is probably fairly justified for that population.
Yeah, absolutely. So, I think you made an important point there, which is that the majority of our PFA technology that we've been using has been these large footprint bipolar biphasic catheters, right? So now we're starting to get the biphasic monopolar catheters, and this is another example of that. And I think one thing I found really interesting about your presentation was the discussion. Now, these are in animal models of the lesion size. So we had about a 9-millimeter lesion width, and then we could get anywhere from 5 to 8 millimeters deep, depending on how we stacked it. And so we're now titratable for our lesion, as well as flexibility as far as the ability to deliver lesions outside the pulmonary veins. So I want to ask your comments first about kind of lesion depths, monopolar catheters. Like, what's your thoughts on that with this system?
Yeah. So just to highlight for the audience who may not have been an operator in this study, so the nominal lesion application in this study was a single application. And you're right, the preclinical testing demonstrates that with additional applications, we can generate deeper lesions. And that probably will have potential advantages for ablation in other chambers or particularly thick parts of the atrium. But I think there's been a lot of discussion about the merits and the values of different PFA systems and the adage that if you studied one, you've studied one. And I think, these single-tip catheters will have an important role in practice. And particularly in difficult-to-get spots, not the topic of the study, but when we want to ablate in the anterior interventricular vein or other difficult-to-reach spots in the ventricle, they may be critically important.
I agree. So, I think co-localization with monopolar PFA, we're finding because we're ablating towards that patch as opposed to between 2 electrodes, potentially we're getting deeper, right? But there's also the concept of co-localization RF and PF. I think that there are data with a different system in a swine model, right? The dual-energy SDSF, that maybe co-localization helps, but maybe with other systems, it has a different effect. So this has the ability to deliver both energies. So talk to me a little bit about co-localization with now RF and PF. What's your take on that right now?
So, there's been limited preclinical data, often conflicting with the TactiFlex catheter. The early data suggests that whether you give PF or RF in sequence, the lesion depths are not dramatically different. The one difference with a single tip catheter is that as you apply contact force, it's obviously going to get deeper in the tissue and draw some of the tissue up around the catheter. And so that's why the single tip catheters may be more sensitive to contact force than their multipolar or large footprint companions. And so I think, one of the most exciting things about the study is actually the development of this PFA index that may allow us to help us understand, as we learn more about the tissue we're trying to ablate, understanding what our goals might be. So we know from the trial that if someone did the PVI and achieved a PFA index value of 25 or more anteriorly and 20 or more posteriorly, and the lesions were all within 6 millimeters of each other, we know those patients had an 86% effectiveness. And so it's an early story, but I think these indices will have value both in the atrium and potentially in other chambers as well.
So I'll say, as a participant in the study, this index was calculated retrospectively, because I did not target an index during the procedure, but I think that's very interesting. So you talked about the components of that index, right? So one of them being contact force, which, I think has some controversy about to what degree it impacts lesion depth. Your argument is with a focal catheter, maybe it has more of an impact. I think we've seen that with Hiroshi Nakagawa's data. But tell us a little bit more about what were the other components of that index.
Yeah, so there was a lot of work done to develop the index. A lot of variables were tested, but at the end of the day, the number of applications or pulses, the contact force, and the tissue impedance were the three variables that had the greatest predictive power. And those are the pieces of information that the index is derived from.
Great. Well, I think objective measures to understand, hey, how are we applying PFA, what do we know to be effective, will be helpful for operators trying to standardize how they use this. So I think that's a huge contribution. And then to kind of go back quickly to that co-localization comment, we actually did a mitral line with co-localization in this study. And while it is controversial whether we'd achieve what lesion depths you achieve with co-localization, one thing we did learn was that when you PF on top of RF, the behaviors were all very, very typical. But if you RF'd on top of PF, you had tremendous temperature spikes that we had to overcome with increasing the irrigation. So we typically do PF on top of RF for that reason in this system. So
I think the biggest value of dual energy, of course, is you don't need to use PF where it might potentially cause harm. Near the mitral annulus, near the coronaries. So, again, when you speak to the versatility of the platform, I think it's a huge advantage.
Absolutely. And so for the longest time, these focal catheters were our workhorse, right? I mean, TactiFlex came out shortly before the era of PFA. It had tremendous adoption. Now we have Dual-Energy TactiFlex, or TactiFlex Duo. But the world has changed so much with PFA. Where do you see this all settling out eventually in our practice, kind of moving forward?
Yeah, I mean, it's a complex road moving forward, because we haven't even talked about, the differences in the operational conduct or the ideal workflows for a hospital versus an ambulatory surgical center, and the considerations on anesthesia. I do think there will be a role for single tip precise catheters moving forward. Probably not in a de novo PVI who has no evidence of adjunctive flutter or other arrhythmias. But certainly for redo procedures, for complex cases where flexibility is paramount, I think a tool like the TactiFlex Duo is going to be a very efficient way to approach the patient's needs.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, I think having taken a couple of these actually in compassionate use into the ventricle, I can say even with the atrial waveforms, their performance has so far been very, very good. So these are early data, right? 6-month IDE data, but excellent results. And John, as always, a great discussion. Thank you very much for joining me.
Oh, it's a pleasure to be here. Thanks for having me.
Yeah. And thank you all for tuning into Heart Rhythm TV.